The year is 1942. The vast, sprawling nation of China, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, is engaged in a brutal, existential war of attrition against the Japanese Empire. For 5 bloody years, since the Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937, the Chinese have resisted, absorbing horrific casualties and trading vast swaths of territory for time. But now, the noose is tightening. The coastal ports, from the bustling wharves of Shanghai to the trading hubs of Canton, are under firm Japanese occupation or suffocating naval blockade. The main supply routes, the arteries that once funneled modern weapons, medical supplies, and heavy machinery into the Chinese interior, have been severed one by one. China, technically the largest allied partner in Asia by population, is effectively isolated from the world, a besieged fortress starving for the tools of war. The only lifeline that sustained the Chinese war effort until that moment, the only thread preventing total collapse, was the Burma Road. This was not a highway in the modern sense. It was a desperate scar carved into the earth. Spanning 717 miles of winding, treacherous, and unpaved mountain highway, it connected the railhead at Lashio in British Burma to the Chinese city of Kunming. It had been cut by hand out of the Yunnan Mountains by 200,000 Chinese laborers, men, women, and children, working with hand chisels, wicker baskets, and primitive stone rollers between 1937 and 1938. It was a testament to human will, but a logistical nightmare. A ribbon of mud prone to massive landslides, choked with disorganized traffic, and barely functional during the torrential monsoon season. Yet it was the only link. It was the carotid artery of the Chinese resistance. Then came the catastrophe. In April 1942, Japanese forces, having swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, invaded Burma. The British colonial defenses crumbled. Within weeks, the critical Burmese port of Rangoon fell, and soon after the Japanese seized the railhead at Lashio. The Burma Road was cut. The last thread connecting China to the Allied world was broken. China was now entirely alone. The strategic implications were terrifying for the Allies in Washington and London. If China collapsed, millions of Chinese troops would surrender or disband, and the massive Japanese army currently tied down on the Asian mainland, over 1 million soldiers, would be freed. These battle-hardened divisions would be redeployed to the Pacific Theater to fight Americans on the islands or to prepare for the invasion of India. The immediate problem facing the Allies was how to keep Chiang Kai-shek in the fight. Without fuel for his meager air force, without artillery shells for his armies, and without the medical supplies to treat the rampant disease in his ranks, the Chinese front would disintegrate. The desperate, immediate solution was a logistical improvisation so audacious, so dangerous, and so geographically impossible that it was nicknamed the Hump. This was an air supply route, the single most dangerous flight path in the world over the Himalayan foothills and the eastern end of the mountain chain. It ran from crude, sweltering airfields in the Assam Valley of India across the highest and most rugged terrain on Earth into Kunming, China. The air route was a killer. The pilots of the Air Transport Command, ATC, and the China National Aviation Corporation, CNAC, navigated without proper radio beacons, flying blind through instrument conditions for hours. They fought fierce, unpredictable winds, updrafts that could shoot a plane up 3,000 feet in seconds, and downdrafts that could slam it into a granite peak.
They flew over mountain ranges that reached 16,000 feet, often in unpressurized aircraft where the crews struggled for breath in the thin, freezing air. The weather, known among the pilots as Chinese air, was violent. It was capable of snapping a wing off a C-46 transport plane without warning. Ice was a constant deadly companion. It would coat the wings, destroying lift and sending heavily laden transports spiraling into the jungle below. Furthermore, the route was not uncontested. Japanese Zero fighters operating from bases in occupied Burma patrolled the route, hunting the slow, unarmed transport planes. The aircraft themselves were often pushed beyond their limits. The C-46 Commando, a workhorse of the operation, was notorious for fuel leaks. Pilots grimly nicknamed it the flying coffin because if a leak occurred at altitude, the fuel would vaporize and explode. The air graveyard quickly grew. Aluminum debris glinted from the jungle canopy and the rocky slopes of the Himalayas, marking the resting places of lost crews. By the end of the campaign, over 1,600 Americans and Allied personnel lost their lives flying the hump, and nearly 600 Allied aircraft were destroyed. The route became known simply and tragically as the Aluminum Trail.
Despite the heroic sacrifice of the pilots of the India-China wing, the tonnage delivered was never enough. It was a trickle when a flood was needed. In late 1942, the hump was delivering only 5,000 tons of supplies per month, barely enough to keep the U.S. 14th Air Force flying, let alone supply the Chinese Army. By contrast, the initial Burma Road had, on its best days, moved 3 times that amount. The hump was a logistical miracle, but it was a stopgap. It was aspirin for a patient who needed surgery. To sustain a fighting front that could threaten the Japanese occupation and serve as a staging ground for the eventual bombing of Japan, the Allies needed not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of tons of materiel. They needed tanks, heavy artillery, millions of gallons of gasoline, and miles of pipeline. You cannot fly a tank over the Himalayas in a C-47. They needed a road. The mission to build a new road into China, a road that would bypass the Japanese occupation and reconnect the severed artery, was assigned to the American commander in the China-Burma-India theater, General Joseph Warren Stilwell. A tough, famously pragmatic, and often cantankerous officer nicknamed Vinegar Joe, Stilwell understood the scale of the commitment better than anyone. He knew that the British were skeptical, preferring to focus on the defense of India. He knew that Chiang Kai-shek was wary, preferring air support to ground offensives, but Stilwell was adamant. The new road would have to be built from Lido, in the Assam province of India, across the Patkai Range, through the Hukong and Moagong valleys of northern Burma, and link up with the old Burma Road near the Chinese border. It would traverse roughly 500 miles of impenetrable, malaria-infested jungle, steep Himalayan terrain, and swamp, all while fighting a brutal jungle war against the Japanese 18th Division, who occupied the very ground where the road needed to go. The project was officially named the Lido Road, but to the men who built it, it was simply Pick's Pike, named for the relentless engineer commander, General Lewis A. Pick, who later took charge of the construction.
Construction began in December 1942. The primary labor force eventually swelled to over 15,000 American soldiers and 35,000 local Indian, Burmese, and Chinese laborers. But the composition of the American force is a critical, often overlooked chapter of history. The vast majority of the American troops building the Lido Road, over 60%, were African-American soldiers serving in segregated engineer battalions. These men, serving in a military that treated them as second-class citizens, were given the most grueling assignment in the theater. Units like the 858th and 823rd Aviation Engineer Battalions became the backbone of the construction effort. This was not a civilian project. It was a combat engineering mission conducted in hell. The first enemy was the geography itself. The road had to cut through dense, triple canopy jungle where trees grew 150 feet tall and the underbrush was so thick that visibility was often less than 10 feet. The route crossed the Patkai mountain range, requiring the road to snake up precipitous cliffs with sheer drops of thousands of feet. The second enemy was the climate. The annual monsoon season, which began in May and lasted until October, turned the region into a waterlogged nightmare. The Hukong Valley received an average of 100 to 140 inches of rain per year. When the rains came, the raw earth turned into an inescapable, axle-deep mire. The mud was not just dirt, it was a viscous, glue-like adversary that swallowed trucks whole. Engineers often had to use high-pressure steam hoses just to blast the mud away from the radiator grills and tracks of the bulldozers so the machines wouldn't overheat. The third enemy was disease. The area was known as the Valley of Death for a reason. It was riddled with tropical sickness. Malaria was ubiquitous. At times, entire platoons were incapacitated. Dysentery, scrub typhus spread by mites, and jungle rot ravaged the construction battalions. Leeches hung from the trees and infested the swamps, dropping onto the men as they worked. Casualties from disease often exceeded casualties from combat. At one point in 1943, nearly 80% of the engineer force was classified as effective only on paper, with thousands of men suffering from fevers and infections. The road was famously called a highway of sweat and blood. The fourth enemy was the Japanese. The engineers and the Chinese armies they supported, the X-Force, trained by Stilwell in India, were not just building, they were constantly clearing, fighting, and defending their forward positions. The road construction tip was often only a few miles behind the front line. Bulldozer operators worked with rifles strapped to their machines. Snipers harassed the survey teams. Every mile of the road had to be won from the enemy before it could be paved.
The sheer scale of the engineering effort defied belief and industrial precedent. The Lido Road required the construction of 10 major bridges and 107 minor bridges to span the ravines and the raging tributaries of the Hukong and Irrawaddy valleys. This was not a primitive trail. Stilwell demanded a logistical highway. American engineers, applying the standardized, mechanized principles of industrial construction, designed and built entire bridges in days. Where the Chinese had used hand tools and human power on the old Burma Road, the Americans brought the full force of their logistical and industrial capacity. They deployed thousands of Caterpillar D7 bulldozers, heavy-duty Mack dump trucks, Northwest power shovels, and self-propelled graders. This was the first time heavy earth-moving equipment had been used in such terrain. The sight of a D7 bulldozer crashing through the bamboo, knocking down giant teak trees, became a symbol of American industrial might in the jungle. This equipment was often disassembled, airlifted piece by piece over the hump, and then reassembled in the mud of Lido to begin the work. The terrain itself was a technical nightmare. At the Naga Hills, the road had to ascend to an altitude of 4,500 feet via gradients so steep that they had to be carved out of sheer rock face. Dynamite and specialized drills were used almost continuously. The engineers cut a shelf into the mountainside, often working on bamboo scaffolding hanging over the abyss. General Stilwell, who was obsessed with the road's progress and staked his entire reputation on it, often marched ahead of his troops, personally inspecting the construction. He envisioned a road that was not a treacherous mountain path, but a standardized, two-lane logistical corridor capable of handling heavy 6x6 trucks moving in convoys 24 hours a day. The road was eventually renamed the Stilwell Road by Chiang Kai-shek, a tribute to the American general's iron-willed determination despite their frequent personal conflicts.
The road advanced slowly, measured in feet per day, but inexorably. As the Chinese X-Force pushed the Japanese 18th Division back, capturing key towns like Xingbiwang and Michkina, the bulldozers were right behind them, widening the trails, laying gravel, and building culverts. But the road was only half the story. Parallel to the asphalt and gravel, the engineers laid another vital artery, the pipeline. The China-Burma-India pipeline was a feat of engineering that rivaled the road itself. It consisted of two parallel 4-inch lines, later upgraded to 6-inch lines, that pumped gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel from the tankers in Calcutta and Chittagong all the way to the airfields in China. This solved a critical logistical paradox. If you transport fuel by truck over 1,000 miles, the truck burns a significant portion of its payload just making the trip. The pipeline freed the trucks to carry ammunition and food. The engineers laid this pipe through the jungle, often under fire, welding sections together in the mud. By the end of the war, this pipeline was the longest in the world. By August 1944, after nearly 2 years of brutal combat and engineering, the Lido Road finally reached the original Burma Road near the town of Mongyu. The link was made. The new road and the old road were joined. The ground supply route to China was finally re-established. The first convoy was an emotional and logistical triumph, a piece of theater designed to show the world that the blockade was broken. On January 12, 1945, a column of 113 vehicles, ranging from jeeps to heavy 6x6 trucks carrying 25 tons of supplies, began the grueling journey from Lido, India. The convoy was led by General Pick himself. It included Chinese drivers, American engineers, and a heavy security detachment. They drove through the freshly cut jungle, over the new timber bridges, past the battlefields of Myitkyina, where thousands had died to clear the path. On February 4, 1945, the convoy rolled into Kunming, China. The streets of Kunming erupted, firecrackers exploded, bands played, and thousands of Chinese civilians lined the streets to cheer the arrival of the trucks. The blockade was officially broken. The supplies carried by that first convoy, artillery pieces, gasoline, trucks, and specialized equipment, were immediately directed to Chinese armies, allowing them to launch long-anticipated counteroffensives against the Japanese in southern China. The organization required to manage this logistical corridor was immense. The road was subject to strict, centralized control to maximize throughput. First, strict traffic control was implemented. On the narrow, winding mountain stretches, one-way traffic was enforced to prevent bottlenecks. Convoys were scheduled in staggered routes, running day and night.
Second, a dedicated motor transport regiment, comprising thousands of service personnel, maintained a network of standardized repair depots every 50 miles. A truck that broke down was not left to rot, it was immediately repaired or replaced using interchangeable parts. This was the workhorse industrial philosophy applied to the jungle: standardization, interchangeability, and relentless maintenance. The tonnage statistics tell the story of the road's impact. As the war entered its final stages in 1945, the volume of supplies delivered by the Stillwell Road surged, while the Hump Air Route continued to operate and actually increased its tonnage due to better aircraft and airfields. The ground route provided the heavy lift capacity. It allowed for the transport of heavy artillery, tanks, and tens of thousands of vehicles that simply could not be flown in. The ultimate statistical achievement was staggering. Over the brief period it was fully operational before the war ended, the Stillwell Road system delivered approximately 147,000 tons of supplies. But when combined with the pipeline and the parallel air efforts that the road supported by supplying the forward air bases, the total logistical throughput was massive. The pipeline alone delivered over 140 million gallons of liquid fuel. But beyond the raw numbers, the road had a strategic weight. The flow of supplies meant that China remained a viable fighting front. It meant that the Japanese High Command could not ignore the Chinese theater. They were forced to keep over 1 million soldiers stationed in China, troops who otherwise would have been available to defend the home islands against the American invasion, or to reinforce the island chains in the Pacific like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The road was a monument to human sacrifice. The official cost of the road was estimated at $150 million in 1945 currency, but the human cost was far higher. It cost the lives of 1,133 Americans in combat and construction accidents. The casualty rate was often cited as a man a mile. Thousands more Chinese and Indian laborers succumbed to disease, exhaustion, and accidents. The graves of the builders lined the route, often marked only by simple wooden crosses that quickly rotted in the jungle damp.
The Stillwell Road was one of pure, grinding, logistical will. It proved that American industrial capacity, armed with standardized construction equipment and a seemingly limitless supply of fuel and parts, could defeat not only a fanatical enemy, but the most hostile terrain on Earth. It was the triumph of the bulldozer over the bayonet. However, the irony of history is sharp. Within a year of the war's end, the Stillwell Road was largely abandoned. The geopolitical landscape shifted rapidly. Civil war erupted in China between the nationalists and the communists, and the road fell into disrepair. The jungle, held back for 2 years by steam shovels and dynamite, reclaimed the asphalt. The bridges rushed by the monsoon waters collapsed. Today, much of the road is impassable, swallowed by the forest. But its legacy remains etched into the history of logistics. It stands as the single, impossible road that kept an entire nation in the fight until victory was secured. It is a testament to the African-American engineers who built it, the Chinese soldiers who fought for it, and the sheer industrial audacity that believed a highway could be built across the roof of the world. If you found this deep dive into the hidden logistics of World War II compelling, please hit that like button. In the comments, tell us, do you think the immense resources poured into the Lido Road were justified, or should the Allies have focused entirely on the air route over the hump? Subscribe to the World War II Archives for more archival precision narratives on the untold stories of industrial warfare. Next, we're diving into supplying the army that invaded North Africa. You won't want to miss it. This is the World War II Archives.